You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
So, looking at ourselves and laughing, and now I'm not just talking about the post-holiday mirror at the gym. I'm talking about looking at our lives and examining ourselves and laughing and using humour to examine our personal and professional experiences to benefit from it. I think the word is satire, but I'm not 100% sure. Mainly because with all the digital tools in front of me and even the hard copy dictionary over my right shoulder, I just can't be bothered looking. Because I can actually talk to someone about the practice of it and find out how laughing at ourselves and our professional experiences can make us better at what we do. G'day listeners and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host Mick, the humblest host of a show named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist. Not the only show related to Big Carl though, it's good to see people supporting his work. Thanks again for all the support on iTunes, Patreon and social media. It is good to engage with you in conversation. Now, my guest today has a lot of fingers in a lot of pies. There's probably a lot of topics you would like to hear him talk about, but there is one that is really, really on my mind. And it's because I've been following it for a very long time. So, who is my guest? My guest is Steve Leonard. He is a former senior military strategist and the creative force behind the defense microblog, Doctrine Man. He is a career writer and a speaker with a passion for developing and mentoring the next generation of thought leaders. He's a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Some good people there like to support our work. Thanks very much, guys. He's also the co-founder of the national security blog, Divergent Options, and the podcast, The Smell of Victory. Now, you've probably seen us promoting those on social media, a very interesting format for a security blog, one that you can have read. I reckon every read's under three minutes if you read as slow as I do, 2 minutes if you're a normal person. He's also a co-founder and a board member of the Military Writers Guild. They do a lot of work in promoting military writers. They've just had a board and committee shake-up, so let's see how that pans out for 2019, ladies and gents, and a member of the editorial review board of the Arthur D. Simmons Center's Interagency Journal. No idea what that is, but let's just move on. Now, he's also published extensively, and his writing focuses on issues of foreign policy, national security, strategy, and planning, leadership and development, as in the development of leaders, and occasionally fiction. So he does have some fun every now and then. He is an alumnus of the School of Advanced Military Studies. That's SAMS. So just remember, people, it's not an apostrophe after the S. When people say they've been to SAMS, it's not his house. And he led the interagency team that authored the US Army's first stability operations doctrine. So he is the person you need to pick a bone with if you're talking about Stab Ops doctrine. He spearheaded the reintroduction of the operational art into capstone doctrine and wrote the guiding principles for Army design methodology. He is the author of 5 books, numerous professional articles, countless blog posts, and most importantly for us, he's a prolific military cartoonist. Steve, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Mick, and thanks for inviting me on the show today. You know, we've been talking about this for a while, and I'll admit that I was really looking forward to the opportunity. You know, I don't know if you know this or not, but you've got a reputation for being the Aussie man of the defense podcast circuit. So I'm expecting a really lively discussion, maybe some horrendous accidents before it's over, and a lot to laugh about. And to be safe, I want you to know that I also brought along my Australian English to American English dictionary, so I should be able to keep up with you as the podcast goes on and not get lost in the language. But again, thanks for having me here. This is a big deal for me, so I'm really happy to be here.
No, thanks for coming on the show, Steve. Definitely after I think I pitched this to you over a year ago, and then life got in the way. Not your life, my life, which happens because as you said, I'm an extremely famous podcast host, and there are demands of having that sort of burden of, I guess there's a cult of personality out there that does weigh me down. Now, before we start discussing the use of satire to examine our professional selves, let's talk about how you, a expert in military theory, leadership and career military officer, became a popular cartoonist.
So this is actually a really good question. It's a question that I get asked more times than I can count, but it's always worth revisiting because this is something that's probably inside an awful lot of us. I've always been someone who's known as having an offbeat sense of humor. And frankly, if I took the advice that was offered to me as a captain, a major, and a lieutenant colonel, which always, if you took yourself more seriously, you'd probably get promoted. Well, I didn't take myself seriously, and I still found a way to get promoted. So I embrace that sense of humor. So the actual thought of being a cartoonist, it evolved probably starting in the late 90s. Where I started to play with cartoons, and it was mostly when I was at the Commander General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and that's where it really came to a crescendo initially. And our class yearbook needed a cartoonist, and I thought, hey, this would be great, because the cartoons that we were looking at running in the yearbook were all from previous years. In some cases, they were Vietnam-era cartoons that really weren't funny anymore. They'd lost context, but they were safe because, hey, they were already gone through editing. So I offered my services, which were promptly rejected by the chaplain who led our yearbook effort, because he felt that my humor was too offensive for such an august publication and population. Now, if you've ever been to the War College, or the Staff College, you know what it's like when you get a group of majors, senior captains together. They're all so serious. Nobody ever laughs. It's just focus on the education and grow and learn, and that's it.
Yeah.
So I took that like I would anything else that somebody told me that I thought was absolutely stupid, which was I just wrote it off and continued to scribble them out. And over the course of a few years, I began to share them when I was reassigned back to Fort Leavenworth years later as a doctrine writer. And I shared those cartoons with a very small group of cubicle dwellers that are around me. 2-3 guys here and there. I'd have a cartoon, I'd throw it out, we'd all get a good laugh. And over time, somebody would say, hey, can you add Mick to the list? Can you add, so-and-so to the list? And the list grew over time. And it got bigger and bigger until it reached a point where it was too big for Outlook.
Yeah.
And so I started a Facebook page. And it started with posting a cartoon or two here and there, or actually a daily cartoon. And those cartoons literally were how we made fun of ourselves and how we could laugh and learn at the same time. You can suffer through your profession, or you can learn to laugh at what you do, because we're in a profession where, frankly, there's an awful lot of things to laugh at, and you need to be able to get that out. It's a good venting mechanism. So the Facebook page led to everything else, and quite honestly, it grew beyond any expectations. It went from, I can literally say, it started with about 5 people in a room, and then I think today we're pushing 170,000 people worldwide. So it kind of grew into its own animal.
Yeah, no, your Facebook page at the moment has 168,381 people. And I mean, after this interview, and I've got what I need from you, will be 168,380 people. But it's interesting. It's truth, justice, and a sucker punch of snark as a tagline there, which is very good to see that someone's sense of humour that was defeated by Outlook has actually found a home somewhere else, because I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that have found that their professional ICT systems are probably only conducive to work, and that their employers really don't have their senses of humour in mind when they create these networks, which is quite frankly rude. Now,
True.
I'm obviously a big fan of Doctrine Man. Been following it for a long time. Probably count in one of those early Facebook fans. Noting that when you jumped onto Facebook, I was probably quite addicted to Facebook at the time. And Doctrine Man is your most popular creative project. But as I discussed when introducing you to our listeners, you've got quite a few up your sleeve. So we're going to stick to Doctrine Man mainly because, well, it just gets us more listeners. But also because it's on the topic of the interview, and it's the satirical comic strip about the modern experience of military professional. Now, more than just why you created it, as in it fell out of a sense of humour that you were actually asked to include in your yearbook. I'd just like to note that for those people that have studied with me and done yearbooks with me, I was never asked. Thanks. But I'm better on stage anyway, ladies and gents. But the why write something about the experience of the military professional? Did it serve a greater purpose than just having a laugh?
That's a fascinating question, because before I did cartoons, I did a lot of article writing, and my goal every year was to publish at least one article. So I do long form writing, medium form writing, and I always have. But surprisingly enough, you reach a much bigger audience with something that makes them stop and laugh. And if you can combine the ability to laugh and learn at the same time, it's much more powerful. And so what you end up with is those cartoons were literally the release of frustrations. So every cartoon you see, there's a true story behind it. And this year, what I'm trying to do is, when I post a cartoon, talk about the story, maybe very briefly, but introduce the story behind it. So, you take the example today of the cartoon today was one that I ran in 2014 that dealt with being insulted by someone in a way that when you stopped talking, you had to go to the Urban Dictionary and look it up to see what it was. And you realize that that's very common in our profession, that people say stuff and you'll laugh and have absolutely no idea what in the world it meant. And I go back to the background to that story was in my last deployment, I spent a year in Iraq, and I had a group of Air Force officers that worked for me, and they literally pulled up those kinds of things that I laugh and then have to go look it up. And one of the things that they constantly said was, and forgive me, I'm going to apologize to your listeners in advance, because it's not a long story, but it's a little bit longer, and it can be offensive, especially if you go look it up. So the phrase that they used was, when one of them made a mistake, was they would look at the other one and say, "Don't make me donkey punch you. Don't do that again." And we'd all giggle and laugh. Yeah. And when I left Iraq, they gave me a flag, and across the bottom of the flag was embroidered, "Don't make me donkey punch you." I never gave it a second thought. It's a beautiful flag. I had it framed. I put it in my office. And when I'm a 3-star level G3, one of my officers files an IG complaint against me for having sexually explicit material on my wall. And to this day, up to that day, I had no idea what it meant, other than that in the context of what had been discussed as a group. Yeah. And so our chief of staff and the IG come in, and they're in my office, and they're looking all over, and they don't see anything. And of course, they didn't know what it meant either, so they weren't looking for that. They were looking for something sexually explicit on the wall, and they couldn't find anything, and they saw everything, and it's just a standard office. And they say, there's something supposedly in here about sex with a goat or sex with a donkey. And I'm like, why in the hell would I put something like that on my wall? And then it occurred to me what it was, and we all sat down, we looked it up, and we took the flag down, and it never went up again. Yeah. And it was, those kind of things that happen every day around us. And you they end up in comic strips that, there's just those little things about our life that's unique that we all appreciate, we can laugh about, and then it leads to a little story. You say, hey, did you see that cartoon? Man, I remember the time that I, talked to the G6 and asked for a new computer, and he gave me a Commodore 64 and said, figure it out on your own. And we all can appreciate and laugh about those kinds of things. That's our life.
Yeah. He gave you a new Commodore 64 out of the packaging, but he did give you a new computer. Listeners, I urge you not to look up what donkey punch means. I've unfortunately had a career where you find out information like that, much like Steve. Don't look it up, but just accept Steve's word that it is not something you want on the wall, and it doesn't belong in popular conversation or polite conversation, because you'll probably find it in a lot of popular conversation. Now, it's quite interesting how you talk about using this just to almost as a cathartic response to the professional lives of the people you write about, which are, Doctrine Man writes about people in the military. Were you surprised by the popularity of Doctrine Man? I mean, I'm not saying I have less than 170,000 followers worldwide, but just if I did, I would be surprised if I was over that. Are you surprised? Were you surprised? Like, Doctrine Man's quite a popular thing.
Oh, absolutely. Because there was never. I'll admit that I never looked that far down the road. It was a way to share satire, to get people to laugh, talk about issues, and as it grew, it was a surprise. And the bigger that it got, the more you realize what's at stake, because then you become someone that people look to, and you have to be responsible for what you say and what you post. And that really hit home to me. As a kid who grew up reading comic books, I always remembered the line from The Amazing Spider-Man that with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies when you have a large social media following, especially if you wear the uniform, because you have to live those values as much online as you do in real life, because it is real life. And so if people know who you are, you have to carry yourself with the same professionalism and dignity that you would otherwise. And so you have to be very aware of that, and you have to carry yourself appropriately. You have to live the same values online that you would elsewhere. And that level of responsibility, that was probably the biggest shock, because I got over the fact that people followed, but it was, okay, now we have to be more careful, and we have to cull the audience. So then you have to have like filters in place, so you don't have people coming on and using obscene language or threatening people or personal attacks. You want a place where people can come and have good, useful dialogue, and the amount of work that goes into that is phenomenal. Especially when you don't have the option of sitting on the Facebook page all day long, which I didn't, and I still don't. I work during the day.
Yeah.
So I can post things, and I have to step away, and I have to know that the page will self-regulate itself to a certain point, and that people will let me know if a certain individual crosses a line or it gets personal, because you don't want to be accused of hosting a page that's vile or that promotes negative behavior. Yeah. You don't want to be the next Marines United or something along those lines. You don't want to go down that road, and so that was probably more of an impact than the popularity. I can live with 170,000 people who poke at me day and night, but I can't live with one message from somebody who says, hey, this person attacked me, threatened me, this person showed up at my house with food at 6 a.m., which has happened. And you see those kinds of things, and you realize that just what the responsibility is that you bear when you have that much of an audience.
I actually find it amazing that you literally have explored a concept brought to you through the medium of comics, the Spider-Man comic, you've then had to live through that based on your own comic, which is probably unexpected when you read that Spider-Man comic. I'm just going to throw it out there. But in future, read DC because they're better. So you were anonymous for a long time as well, though, talking about the responsibility you had as a uniform member, also putting this out there, getting a large following and having people be quite responsive to it and it becoming popular. And you as you mentioned, you were serving when you started, and there's a limit to what people who work for public institutions can say or do, whilst letting people know that they work for an organisation. Now, what is the value of allowing military professionals, policy, career public servants engage in projects similar to Doctrine Man? These people who work for the public institutions but may have something to say.
So that's there's a two-part answer to this question. And the first part deals with anonymity, because anonymity is it's almost a misnomer. So yep. You invoked the DC comic universe there a couple minutes ago. Yeah. So when I created Doctrine Man as a character and then as a page, I did it with the idea that Doctrine Man was a parallel to Superman. Yeah. In the sense that if you remember, nobody knew that Clark Kent was Superman until he takes his glasses off and then he said, "Oh, it's Superman." Yeah. So Superman's there the whole time, and so the anonymity was not really there. It was Doctrine Man was me in the sense that I was the creator. I was there. I never made a great attempt to maintain anonymity. I kept it in my biography. Yeah. Everybody who knew me knew who it was. It was just one of those things. But I would treat it as a Clark Kentism, that you really don't know that I'm Doctrine Man because I have my glasses on. But when I take my glasses off, you're going to have that holy crap moment where you go, wait a minute. And this played out several years later when General Dempsey was the TRADOC commander, our Training and Doctrine Command General. And he literally stopped the presses within his own plans group one week to figure out who Doctrine Man was. And I had someone who had worked for me who was on that staff who would send me emails during the week and say, well, we've got a big whiteboard up. We're trying to connect cartoons and comments to individuals and trying to figure out who it is. And he said at one moment, somebody had an epiphany and said, oh, God, it's Steve Leonard. Of course it is. How could we not know? They talk the same. They act the same. It's the same humor. Everything is there. It's because, you never looked at me except with my glasses on, so you didn't know. Yeah. But I didn't hide it from you either. Yeah. So that drives all the Doctrine Man. The anonymity is more of a joke than a reality. Yeah. Which allowed me to, I felt, say what I needed to say, but do it in a manner that allows you to speak truth to power respectfully and in a way that carries weight. Yeah. So I think it's incredibly valuable. Now to move on to the second part of your question, it's incredibly valuable to have people be able to comment freely on issues as they relate to what we do, as relate to our profession, whether it's defense related, strategy related. It's incredibly important. The challenge is you have to teach people how to carry themselves in a way that allows them to have a successful voice, a meaningful voice. And I'll tell you what I mean with that is that it's really easy to get on Twitter and make a comment about a policy, say that affects defense. It's a hell of a lot harder to get on Twitter and make a comment that resonates and conveys credibility to the people who can influence those policies. And that's that whole truth to power thing. and I see a lot of folks that do this, a lot of people that do this, and they try to do it behind a thin veil of anonymity, which, it kind of works, but it really doesn't work. Because if you're just, pick and choose your pseudonym, if you're hiding behind that veil of anonymity, but yet you say, well, I'm not going to use my real name, but I'm going to list my military biography so I have credibility. That doesn't give you credibility.
Yeah.
It's the fact that you're honest enough to step out and say, hey, this is Mick Cook. This is what I think. I mean, everybody knows you're the dead Prussian, but this is what I think. These are my feelings, and here's how I lay this out. And how you express yourself carries that level of credibility. We want that. But I feel like in this time, with this generation of social media, that we have to teach people how to do that. In the same sense that you wouldn't walk into your brigade commander's office and swear at him or her and think that you're going to carry an argument with slurs, you got to think that in the same sense, when you do it online, you're not going to have any more credibility or have any more power or influence doing that than you would if you walked into somebody's office and did it. You've got to be able to learn to convey that message with credibility and sincerity and authenticity in a way that people listen.
Yeah.
That's what I don't think we're quite there yet. I mean, you like me can probably name all the people, anonymous or not, who can carry a credible argument, and they're far outnumbered by the people who hide behind a veil of anonymity, who are absolutely have no credibility whatsoever.
Yeah, and I guess from what we see a lot with the circles we interact with online, the danger of having a good argument but not a solid foundation for people to see where you state that argument from is that, if there's one flaw in your argument, people will focus on that because they won't trust you.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you're also involved in other projects other than Doctrine Man. In fact, you're quite a busy individual, which just shows your listeners how important this show is, that someone like Steve can take time out to appear on it.
Such as telling the truth. This is an important show.
Some of your other work is divergent options, which I find excellent because they're very, very short, sharp briefs written quite clearly, easy to read. I don't need to read a massive 5,000 word essay every time I want to think about a topic. But a lot of the stuff you work on is focusing on intellectual debate on international relations, national security issues, defense strategy. There's a lot of stuff out there, though. There's I'm going to use a big word in a minute, so I'm going to build up to it. But for younger people, and we're talking about policy interns, university graduates, postgraduates, even the undergrads, junior military leaders in terms of the officer level, and also the senior NCOs that's the senior non-commissioned officers for those people that have never picked up the military acronym and jargon dictionary. But a lot of these people that are trying to read up on some of these issues so they can become important within their own career or study. How do they engage? How would you recommend they engage with the plethora, there's my word, ladies and gents, plethora of material that is out there so that they can perhaps achieve phronesis?
That's a great question because, like you said, there's a plethora, to borrow that term, there is a plethora of places to go, voices to hear, and forums on which to engage. And some are more valuable than others. And I'll tell you, having grown up with this now, I think that I've been doing this for just a little over 10 years. I can still remember when those audiences, when those sites, when those places didn't exist, and have watched them grow and develop. So I can tell you that there were places like the Small Wars Journal, for example, which was a great place when it started. A guy named Dave DeLegge stood that up to talk about a lot of these kinds of issues when the counterinsurgency movement was really afoot. But moving beyond that, Then you had a couple of different things that happened, a couple of different things that occurred. One, I think what we saw first was the growth of the bottoms-up movement, where people started to produce content and fora for discussion. You had that piece, and then you had the other piece where people did the top-down, and almost all the top-down forums failed for one reason or another. And I think it really is driven by the fact that those fora didn't have the right people, and the right people with the right social media savvy driving them. So the bottoms up ones, places like the company leader, the military leader, field grade leader, 3x5 leadership, those places pushing from below produced very simple, easily digestible, useful content that kind of covered that first 10 years of service. And it didn't matter whether you were an NCO, warrant officer, or a commissioned officer, it all had value. And within that space, those kind of forums really grew and developed. And then in the last few years, probably the last 2 years, I have seen three tops down forums work. And it was what you saw out of Australia, where General Ryan began to push some of those things. What you've seen with the Forge and the Cove, absolutely groundbreaking worldwide. I don't think any service in any country has accomplished what's happened on the underside of the planet, where people are actually seeing that take form in a way that appeals across generations. In the same way, I think the Modern War Institute at West Point, for which I'm a non-resident fellow, and I'm absolutely not jaded in any sense or biased about what they've accomplished, but they've done the same kind of thing here, where they have produced a place for people to write of all levels, to discuss topics, just absolutely fascinating. And then the Wavell Room in Great Britain is doing the same thing. I am absolutely amazed to see their growth. And in our own War College with the War Room out of Carlisle is also starting to get its legs underneath it. And those are the kind of places I think for us that provide the most value. In between, you see fora like War on the Rocks, for example. I love War on the Rocks. War on the Rocks absolutely produces a tremendous amount of content. Ryan Evans, the guy who runs it, is wonderful. And he has, when I have had people come to me and ask where to write or where to take topics, Ryan has always worked with me to help those people find their voice. And it's been wonderful. I still think we've got a long ways to go in our country, in my country, in the United States. I don't think we've quite mastered the top-down forum yet, which is funny because I see more people who go to the Cove or to the Forge or to the Wavell Room to catch that. The podcast crew, the folks that really take in the podcasts, they'll go to you, they'll go to the military leader, they'll go to the Modern War Institute before they listen to a podcast done by something that seems to come across as being pushed down to them as opposed to an open discourse. I probably wandered all over the place on this topic, but there are so many places to go. But the key is you got to sort the wheat from the chaff. There's like a plethora. Also meaning a metric crap ton of places to go to get content, but do you want meaningful content? Do you actually want to talk to people who are serious about our chosen profession? That's a lot harder. And then that's something that I tried to provide in my own way on Facebook. And I didn't push it, into its own website because we had our own community and I wanted an open community where anybody could come in and it was less structured, more free flowing. But those other places, all those places that I mentioned, those are great places to go to start. And if you get your foot in the door and start to listen or to read or to absorb information from those venues, you will find others that are just as good, that maybe aren't as well known, but those are great places to start. And honestly, you're talking about 7, maybe 8 sources of really quality information that you don't need to move beyond there right now.
Yeah.
That's a good start.
It's interesting as you list off the different avenues and platforms. I know Ryan Evans. We did some work together in a I suppose a previous life for both of us, and he actually helped me out with this show after my first episode. I called him up and said, "Where am I going with this?" And he helped me find direction. So thanks again, Ryan. Absolute powerhouse of helping people out. And it's also interesting, for Australia. I think one of our most popular ones is Grounded Curiosity.
Which to exclude them.
Which is like the Wave Room, Grounded Curiosity, War on the Rocks, sort of all generated from that, as you said, that ground up approach, but now have some sort of top down investment as well, which kind of meets in the middle. What other very popular podcasts would like though is lots and lots of money investment, but we'll see how they go. Look, Steve, we could talk all morning, or well, I suppose it's almost afternoon there for you, or noon for you. It's definitely not for me. I'm actually in the future compared to where you are in the time-space continuum. Now, Steve, we'll get to our final question. Now, this final question, I'm sure you know what it is, but I'm going to explain it anyway because that's the kind of guy I am. It's one I ask of all guests. It relates to our mission on the show to define war in as many ways as possible, like big Karl von Clausewitz, the dead Prussian himself. And this helps us continue the debate and the conversation on one of the most important things that affects our society in one of the most devastating ways out there. Now, I ask each guest to finish the sentence, war is. So I ask you right now to finish that sentence, war is.
All right. So to quote William Tecumseh Sherman, war is hell. It is the absolute embodiment of chaos, where actions and reactions are occurring incessantly and often unpredictably, and one bullet, missile, rocket, grenade can change the outcome immeasurably. It's unforgiving, especially to those who fail to grasp its inherent complexity, and that is something I think you and our famous dead Prussian try to impress upon us constantly. That is complexity, that war is hell.
It's not the first Sherman quote we've had, but it's a different take on it, which is good because, well, one, I've only just started reading about the US Civil War, so I'm finding it quite interesting. But also, it describes something that I guess, looking at the demographic of a lot of our listeners, we have people out there who've a lived experience in it and people who don't have a lived experience in it. And it's worth reminding people that we don't do these activities like this show, some of the work you're involved in, because we think, war is a tops place to be, which is quite an Australian phrase, tops place to be. Steve, thank you very much for coming on the show, and thank you very much for giving me a laugh every day.
I really appreciate you having me on the show. It means a lot, and it's I've got my my dose of the dead Prussian today, and it's all downhill from here. So, thank you, Mick, and thanks for everybody for listening in. And hopefully, you'll when this posts, you'll feel compelled to drop millions into the Patreon account and push the dead Prussian into the atmosphere, the economic atmosphere. So he doesn't have to do anything anymore but just podcast for us.
That would be the dream. And you heard him, listeners. Once this episode finishes on whatever device or machine you're listening to it on, the rest of your day is going to be terrible. Listeners, It is Monday where you are. It's Tuesday where I am, and I got to tell you, having just lived through Monday, it's not that great. So if you've got the opportunity, go back to bed. Ladies and gents, make sure you support Steve's projects, if for nothing else, your own enlightenment. You can find Doctrine Man on Twitter, which is where a lot of these conversations happen, at Doctrine_Man. But you can also find him on Facebook, which I recommend because the Facebook one is where I view all the comic strips each day. You can also support the other projects Steve's involved in. That includes reading some of the writing he does at places like Divergent Options or the Modern War Institute or everything I listed in his bio. Go out and buy his 5 books. You're not doing anything this weekend. I know you're not, because you're listening to my show and that implies a certain type of demographic. Go out and buy his books and help him out. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.